Hello. Welcome to this edition of the Center for European Studies Conversations on Europe series. Our speaker today, I think, is well known to many of you. Rita Chin is Associate Professor of History here at the University of Michigan. She's a specialist in the history of late modern Europe. For those of you who aren't Europeanists, late modern begins somewhere around 1750, 1789, depends on what country you're talking about. So she works on history of 19th and 20th century Europe. She's in her, Rita actually has quite an interesting mix of interests. She has a very strong interest in intellectual and cultural history. If you looked, for example, at her mentors when she was in graduate school, you would see that that had been their focus. But she has also long focused on the history of migrations and the mobility of peoples in Europe. And in particular, she's interested in the consequences of this mobility for conceptions of European culture and European politics. She received her PhD from the University of California, Berkeley in 1999, and she published her first book, The Guest Worker Question in Post-War Germany, in 2007 with Cambridge University Press. And this is a really interesting book. There's a tremendous amount of work on migration in Europe, as many of you might know, and much of this seems to be of a kind of social scientific character, demographic studies, studies of policy debates. And what distinguished Rita Chin's work on this question was its insistence on a kind of interdisciplinary focus. So indeed, she did look at policy debates, labor recruitment of workers in Germany in the post-war years. But she also looked very closely at other arenas that had not really been connected by historians to these debates, such as interesting groups of writers from the migration themselves, Turkish writers, for example, living in Germany, whose literary work engaged the problem of what it meant to be German in the post-war decades in this context of migrations of peoples. She argued, in fact, and maybe I'm over-dramatizing the argument, I'll say it anyway, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but she argued, in fact, that by the late 1980s, there was, in fact, a quite vibrant discussion within Germany about the possibility of creating a distinctly German a German-flavored multicultural society. But that unfortunately this discussion was derailed by all the tumultuous events that followed the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and then the ensuing discussions about the integration of East Germans, and in particular integration of ethnic Germans from lands further east, which made it much more difficult to establish a sense of continuity in the earlier conversations about multiculturalism that had begun in the 1980s. So she is the author of many articles, which I will not cite for you. She is the recipient of many grants and fellowships. I should perhaps also note that she is the editor, along with Heidi Fehrenbach, Jeff Ely, and Atina Grossman, of a collection of essays entitled After the Nazi Racial State, Difference and Democracy in Germany and Europe. That came out in 2009. And her talk today continues on this theme. The title, as you can see, From Rasse to Race, the Problem of Difference in the Federal Republic of Germany. Thanks for being here, and let's welcome her to our...
Thanks, Josh. Thank you all for coming out. It's nice to have a chance to present some of my work at the Center for European Studies, and I'm especially happy to be speaking today in conjunction with the college's theme semester on race. So what I want to do today is consider the invisibility of race in German public discourse and historical writing. And then given this invisibility, explore how we might get at the ways that difference has nonetheless structured conceptions of belonging in Germany after 1945. I'm going to do this by focusing on West German leftists and their engagement with guest workers. But this is a somewhat tricky proposition because the most striking feature of the German left's thinking about post-war foreign laborers, at least until the 1970s, is its absence. So a large part of what I'm going to try and do today is explain this absence, how it came about, and what the long-term effects of the initial lack of engagement have been. So in terms of organization, I've structured my talk in 3 sections. First, I want to say a very brief word about the problem of race in post-war German historiography, so the writing of history. Then I'll turn to the specific case of West German 1968ers. And here I want to unpack the ideological conditions that made guest workers largely invisible in terms, within the terms of the New Left's social critique, focusing on 3 major preoccupations: the project of democratization, the parameters of the guest worker program, and the legacy of Nazism. The specific assumptions and priorities that emerged from these frameworks, I argue, shaped 1968ers' ideas about race and racism. And then finally, I want to end with a recent example of racial confrontation in the German soccer leagues to draw some conclusions about the analytical utility and, I would say, even necessity of race for understanding contemporary German society and the place of immigrants within it. So I should say at the outset that what I'm doing is pretty schematic. I traverse a number of examples and move fairly quickly across time in order to establish some broader patterns and analytic touchstones. So I move around a little bit, especially in the second part of the talk. Okay, so first to historiography. In contrast to the current tendency of Third Reich scholarship to stress the ubiquity of racial ideology in the regime's policies and practices, work on the post-war period has paid scant attention to the ways that assumptions about race shaped society in the 2 Germanys. The pattern first struck me as I was writing my first book on guest workers. None of the sources that I used, not the government documents, not the policy memoranda, newspapers, or even the cultural production by Turkish Germans, discussed guest workers in relation to racial difference or racism. But in order to do justice to the place of Turks and other foreigners in West German society, I found that it was necessary to be explicit about the fundamental yet unspoken ways that their presence has been marked by various forms of racialized exclusion. This led me to collaborate on a project with Heidi Fehrenbach in order to address how race itself has been treated in the study of modern German history more generally. One of our main arguments was that there's been a notable absence or silence on the issue of race in the post-45 period, so after the fall of the Third Reich, as if the problem of race largely disappeared. To the extent that the question has been taken up, scholars have focused on the context of US military occupation and Americanization. But even for earlier periods in modern German history, the tendency has been to limit inquiries on race and difference to highly specific episodes, to Germany's colonial projects in Africa and Asia, or to the Nazi state. This inclination to circumscribe the relevance of race as a category of analysis has made it difficult to grasp both the continuities and discontinuities in racial ideologies across modern German history. More fundamentally, though, there's been a conceptual inability to distinguish race as a fixed or almost natural category of difference from what scholars in other fields now refer to as racial formation or racialization. And this is particularly true in the American field. These distinctions, I'm sure, are familiar to at least some of you, but let me be clear about what I mean. Race in the latter framework is a socially constructed, historically contingent category of essential difference. The meaning of race, as Michael Omi and Howard Wynant suggested over 20 years ago, is defined and contested in both collective action and personal practice. In the process, they argue, racial categories themselves are formed, transformed, destroyed, and reformed. Racial formation, then, refers to the process, right? So it's a process of investing meaning in racial categories. The extension of racial meaning to relationships, social practices, or groups previously understood in non-racial terms. Now, this category, or this socially constructed, historically contingent notion of race, I think is particularly important for historians of post-war Germany, precisely because the category or the term Rasse quickly became taboo in both new states, and the language of race was largely expunged from public discourse. After 1945, race ceased to be an explicit or widely invoked frame of reference for most Germans. For historians taking their cues from their subjects, and I will admit that I was one of them, especially when I was writing that book on guest workers, it would be easy to see a rupture between pre- and post-1945 periods and conclude that racial ideology simply disappeared with the demise of Hitler's regime. But the silence around the category of race in both post-war German public debate and historical scholarship compels us to approach the issue in a more roundabout way. We might ask, how was the category of race rendered off limits in post-war Germany? Why did it disappear as a significant rubric for understanding German society? And what have been the social, political, and epistemological effects of the concept's invisibility? So I want to begin to answer some of these questions by looking at West German leftists who came of age in the 1960s. In March of 1966, a remarkable article entitled "Are We Unfair to Guest Workers?" appeared in the conservative weekly Welt am Sonntag, and it read, "Germans who work through their past by being outraged about apartheid in South Africa or race riots in America obviously do not have anything against the apartheid of alien workers in the Federal Republic, against their social boycott and their displacement into ghettos." This early observation captured a central paradox in the West German New Left's approach to social injustice. Young leftists often condemned racial oppression abroad, yet generally missed the fundamental ways that racialized notions of difference structured social relations at home. A very quick survey of the central groups and figures in the West German New Left, including Rudi Dutschke, Bernd Rabel, Tilman Fichter, and the German Socialist Student League, reveals that students served as couriers for the National Liberation Front during the early years of the Algerian War. There were highly visible protests against the Vietnam War and public declarations of solidarity with anti-colonial movements in the Third World. Yet, there was hardly a word about the Federal Republic's policy of importing foreign labor. Unlike their counterparts in the United States and Great Britain, who actively condemned the subjugation of blacks in their respective societies, West German 68ers did not collectively raise questions about the place or treatment of guest workers. My question is why? Why didn't domestic discrimination and prejudice become central targets of the New Left's social criticism? What, in other words, were the conditions of impossibility, the ideological assumptions and contexts that made it so difficult for young leftists to recognize the plight of foreign laborers as crucial to their larger critique of West German society? So, one answer I think can be found in the different notions of democratization that were in play immediately after the war. These ideas about democracy influenced how race and racism would be understood and debated in subsequent years. In the aftermath of World War II, the Allies pressed Germans to make a clean break from the Nazi regime by disavowing state-sponsored racism and publicly embracing democratization. Part of this process involved re-education and denazification, policies introduced by the Allies during occupation. Re-education was aimed at weaning Germans from undue respect for authority, while denazification sought to eliminate Nazis from public life and civil service. Both programs had significant limitations. Above all, the fact that they were administered haphazardly from zone to zone. But they did push post-war Germans to reformulate the social and ideological parameters of their national identity. In particular, these policies underscored the fact that the Third Reich's national ideal of an Aryan Volksgemeinschaft had been powerfully discredited by Nazi defeat. Privileging of an Aryan master race, efforts to destroy the Jews, the belief in a biologically based essential differences between peoples were now firmly attached to the tarnished notion of Rasse. The concept itself thus had to be officially repudiated in order to transform West Germany into a democratic nation. Now, beyond these formalized programs, the United States occupation itself greatly influenced how West Germans thought about the relationship between race and nation. For one thing, the occupation armies were multi-ethnic, right? And this meant that former racial subordinates, whether they were Jews, Slavs, North Africans, or African Americans, now held positions of authority over Germans as members of the Allied forces. At the same time, the U.S. Army's practice of racial segregation and rampant anti-black racism taught West Germans that democratic forms and values could be, as Heidi Fehrenbach has argued, consistent with racialist and even racist ideology and social organization. In this way, military occupation reinforced ideas of white supremacy across American and German cultures, thereby encouraging West Germans to reframe their conceptions of difference through a black-white lens. As they rejected the idea of Rasse and its associations, right, which for the Germans had really been tied to a sense of, an Aryan master race and the genocide of the Jews, West Germans gradually became conversant in and absorbed alternative modes of racial distinction. So for 1968ers, whose formative years coincided with the occupation and founding period of the Federal Republic, they were growing up in a society that was developing a complex, even schizophrenic posture towards race and difference. On the one hand, the category of Rasse was irrevocably tainted by the Nazi legacy, linked permanently to racial science, eugenics, and genocide. On the other hand, West Germany did not espouse a uniform or consistent policy against more immediate forms of racism. Different expressions of racism were treated differently. For example, it became impossible to invoke Rasse in relation to Jewish Holocaust survivors who remained in Germany. Yet it was possible to accommodate the racialist binary of black and white in thinking about the problem of Afro-German children, so the children of African-American GIs and German women, which emerged as a kind of social problem in the 1950s and early 60s. So these two racial taxonomies were always understood as separate and discrete, in no way part of a related set of ideas about difference. While West Germans roundly condemned one taxonomy as racist, they unselfconsciously relied on the other to develop social policy. The emergence of the Cold War mandate pushed the project of democratization in a distinctly different direction. As divisions hardened between the Allies, the US and Britain prioritized economic revival and integrating their zones into the Western Security Alliance. The primary tasks of democratization thus shifted away from purging the remnants of Nazi influence and now lay in building a strong capitalist economy, shoring up democratic political institutions, and forging close economic and military relations with the Western powers. For most West Germans, government ministers and ordinary citizens alike, economic prosperity became the measure of successful democratization, right? So it starts out as tied to a rejection of the old Nazi racial state, and then it shifts with the kind of hardening of the Cold War divisions into a much more economic, capitalist-oriented notion of democratization. Okay, the economic miracle, of course, also served as a crucial catalyst for bringing millions of foreigners back onto German soil. The economic takeoff that began in the 1950s created an urgent demand for manpower, which the native population was ill-equipped to provide. As a result of the high casualty rate among German men during the war and official efforts to encourage women in the wartime workforce to return to the home, authorities faced a massive labor shortage. Their solution was to inaugurate a guest worker program, signing a recruitment treaty with Italy in 1955 and concluding separate agreements with Spain, Portugal, Turkey, Greece, and Yugoslavia through the 1960s. By the fall of 1964, the number of foreign workers in West Germany surpassed 1 million. 5 years later, the figure had nearly doubled. The basic parameters of the guest worker program offered a second framework for shaping the way West Germans including young leftists, perceived foreign laborers and the problem of difference in their society. The program's central premise was that migrants would come to the Federal Republic to work on a temporary short-term basis. Political authorities and industrial leaders agreed on a system in which recruited laborers would rotate in and out of the German labor force based on production demands. Accordingly, labor treaties stipulated 2-year work permits, 2-year residence permits in order to enforce the expectation of return to the country of origin. Citizenship law, moreover, reserves citizen status for those with German ancestry based on the principle of jus sanguinis. By this definition, guest workers were always foreigners. The post-war labor recruitment program presumed that the Federal Republic at its core was not an immigration country. Guest workers were recruited not to become permanent additions to German society, but to provide labor for a limited amount of time and then leave. Political leaders, furthermore, clung to this view of guest workers long after shifting economic conditions undermined the initial logic of short-term residence and rotation. By the early 1960s, firms employing foreigners realized that it cost more money to import new workers every couple of years than to keep the trained ones and absorb the fluctuations in production demands. As rotation proved increasingly unprofitable, authorities ceased enforcing the rule of quick return. That is, they almost always granted permit extensions, effectively allowing Turkish and other foreign laborers to remain in Germany indefinitely. Guest workers, in turn, stretched their stays into years and even decades. Many sent for their spouses and children, especially after 1973, when the Federal Republic halted further recruitment. By the mid-1970s, moreover, Turks had surpassed all other nationalities as the largest community of foreigners in West Germany. Despite the fact that permanent settlement belied the rhetoric of temporary residence, political leaders regularly intoned the same basic mantra on the question of pluralism. The Federal Republic is not a country of immigration. For members of the New Left, not to mention less critical segments of West German society, the federal government's approach to the labor migration made it difficult to apprehend workers as a significant or legitimate part of the social fabric. Everyday slights, such as serving fellow guest workers first, describing Italians as hot-headed, refusing to rent apartments to Yugoslavs, or calling Turks derogatory names like garlic eater, seemed like excusable minor infractions against transient populations, rather than evidence of systematic discrimination or prejudice that indicated an endemic social problem. But even the decision to house guest workers in barracks on the outskirts of town, or city ordinances restricting Turks from living in certain neighborhoods, or the disproportionate number of foreigners concentrated in the dirtiest, harshest, and most unpleasant kinds of work generally did not register as something called racism, because most guest workers were not understood as members of West German society. Racism, in this view, could only be present if prejudice and discrimination were directed against a portion of one's own population. Once ideas about race and difference, moreover, were redefined around a black-white binary, which happened over the course of the 1950s, the possibilities for recognizing racialized or racist attitudes and behaviors beyond this horizon decreased substantially. But perhaps the most immediate reason for young leftists' general neglect of guest workers has to do with their preoccupation with the Nazi legacy. Germany's recent past served as this generation's touchstone, so much so that many new leftists claim retrospectively to have inaugurated the process of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, or overcoming the past. This bold claim has been tempered somewhat by recent scholarship, which now suggests that serious public debate about the Nazi past began in the late 1950s and gained momentum in the first half of the 1960s. Nonetheless, young leftists did intensify this discussion, setting for themselves the task of purging post-war society of what they saw as the lingering effects of Nazi fascism. This novel outspokenness grew out of the fact that these young people had been born near the end or after the war, right? Thus, they had no direct knowledge of and bore no direct responsibility for the crimes committed during the Third Reich. As they came of age in the 1960s, many of the younger generation became increasingly dissatisfied with the short and vague descriptions of the Nazi era in their school books. They began to pose more pointed questions to their parents, and the most radical among them openly condemned their parents' generation, both for its complicity with Nazism and its conspicuous silence about the Nazi period. The critique leveled by young leftists was intimately bound up with the West German version of liberal democracy built and embraced by their parents. According to many 1968ers, the elder Auschwitz generation had blindly pursued capitalist prosperity and embraced anti-communism at the expense of taking responsibility for Nazi crimes, right? So this is coming back to the second sort of definition of democratization and what that would mean for West German society. The failure to deal with the past, new leftist reasoned, meant that fascism had not been fully rooted out of German society. As evidence, they pointed to the reintegration of Nazi party members into civil life by the 1950s, the Bundestag's 1965 passage of the emergency laws, and the wave of political terror inaugurated by the murder of Benno Ohnesorg in 1967. Far from viewing the Federal Republic as democratic in any meaningful sense, students viewed its political institutions as totally corrupt and as themselves facilitating an imminent reconstitution of fascism in West Germany. This sense of continuity, moreover, was bolstered by the New Left's theoretical understanding of Nazism, which interpreted fascism as a product of the highest stage of capitalism. If fascism and capitalism were integrally related, a pressing question for the New Left was how to resist West German state power and radically transform capitalism through revolution, right, which would also involve getting rid of the roots of fascism. In the early 1960s, many had abandoned hope in Marx's traditional revolutionary agent, the working class, whose critical perspective they believed had been co-opted by post-war prosperity. Influenced by the work of Herbert Marcuse and as well as their interaction with third world foreign students, young leftists like Duchka and Rabel began to look for a new revolutionary vanguard of, quote, outsiders and outcasts, the exploited and persecuted of other races and colors, as offering alternative ways to challenge capitalism from the outside. These socially marginalized groups, according to Duchka, represented the living negation of the system. Yet the New Left's preoccupation with capitalism and fascism had a number of unintended consequences. Looking outward, it was easy for West German leftists to survey the international scene and identify exemplary political actors whose campaigns presented a serious challenge to the fascist capitalist system. Members of the SDS thus readily and enthusiastically championed third world foreign students, the Viet Cong, the Black Panthers, each group engaged in far-flung but critical efforts to fight U.S. imperialism's exploitation, genocide, and racial oppression. But turning inward, this theoretical position unwittingly led radical critics to disregard the impact of both systems in the Federal Republic itself. First and foremost, it subsumed the singularity of the Nazis' annihilation of the Jews under the generic and structural term fascism. The effect was to obscure the distinctive aspects of National Socialism as it had developed in Germany, downplaying the anti-Semitic nature of Nazism and ignoring its Jewish victims. But the fixation on capitalism and fascism also obscured the growing importance of race and difference for West German society itself. To be sure, a handful of leftist artists and intellectuals did extend their criticism of capitalism to the guest worker program. The filmmaker Rainer Werner Fassbinder, the social activist Günter Wallraff, the SPD's Young Socialists all questioned the treatment of guest workers in the Federal Republic. In each case, though, the primary targets of critique were self-congratulatory prosperity, capitalist exploitation, and ideological complacency. Importing foreign labor simply represented an extreme example of West Germany's indifference to the human costs of unbridled capitalism. Thus, in considering the all-important question of who would spearhead the revolt against capitalism and fascism inside the Federal Republic, Duchka surveyed the landscape for marginal groups that might fit the bill, but was unable to find a German counterpart to black minorities in the United States. He seemed to acknowledge that Jews might have served this function, although he stopped short of explaining why they were no longer around to do so. Yet, he was unable to imagine guest workers in such a role. Remarkably, in the absence of a recognizably racialized and oppressed outcast, Duchka turned to his own social milieu for a solution, championing radical students and intellectuals as West Germany's missing minority. By framing their social critique through capitalism and fascism, new leftists were highly conscious of the structural continuities between the Nazi regime and the Federal Republic, but surprisingly oblivious to the ways that social actors and conditions had changed. This was true of the young activists' search for a revolutionary subject. It was also true of the response to the establishment of the National Democratic Party in 1964. Members of the student movement were deeply troubled by the emergence of a far-right party with ties to former Nazis. Thousands of radicals clashed with the NPD rank and file in the streets of Frankfurt, Nuremberg, and Dusseldorf in the run-up to federal elections in 1969. The fact that the party remained legal, despite its national socialist overtones, particularly galled them, confirming the Federal Republic had not yet fully shed its anti-democratic culture and Nazi past. Yet young leftists didn't fully absorb the fact that the targets of NPD violence were not the same as the victims of National Socialism. Guest workers, not Jews, were now identified as the threat to the nation's health, economy, and identity. In this way, the conceptual tools, ideological commitments, and political priorities of 1968ers conditioned the nature of their social critique. The effects of such blind spots are especially clear when we consider the broader historical trajectory of anti-racism in West Germany. If 1968ers failed to problematize the treatment of Turks and other guest workers in terms of race or racism, this did not mean that they neglected to organize against movements that they perceived as racist. In June of 1979, nearly 50,000 people gathered in Frankfurt for a Rock gegen Rechts concert, so Rock Against the Right, to protest a large rally by the NPD taking place simultaneously in the city. Organizers, which were made up of a coalition of leftist activists, social democrats, environmentalists, and trade unionists, modeled the event on the Rock Against Racism festivals that had begun in Britain 3 years earlier. Intended as a counter-demonstration, the concert offered a peaceful means to combat the NPD, which for the previous 5 years had held national meetings and bloody marches in Frankfurt as part of an effort to create the first national democratic city in Germany. Yet the ways in which this event was discussed and represented point to some of the unique features of anti-racism in West Germany. Most newspaper coverage of the event focused on the potential clash of left and right-wing demonstrators, a specter that recalled the street battles between communists and brown shirts during the Weimar Republic. The single article about the festival to appear in Die Zeit, for example, discussed preparations for a possible fight in the streets. Such reports devoted more column space to previous NPD provocations than to the current leftist response, reading the increase in far-right activity in terms of an older Nazi template. Just as in 1969, the immediate targets of NPD activity and violence, that is, the guest workers, did not appear in any of the public discussion around the event, not in the press coverage of the far-right rallies, not in the leftist response. Foreign laborers and their families, of course, provided a crucial touchstone for the NPD's political appeal and were often victims of right-wing attacks. Ridding the Federal Republic of foreigners was a key item on the NPD agenda. Yet a curious silence about these seemingly obvious connections prevailed. The specific name chosen for the event, moreover, illustrates how this elision operated in leftist thinking. What had been Rock Against Racism in Britain became Rock gegen Rechts in West Germany. The change seemed to send two messages. First, according to a racial taxonomy of black-white, West Germany did not have a problem with racism because, unlike Britain, it did not have a significant black population. Second, it was one thing to acknowledge and fight right-wing extremism, right, in terms of REICH, but it was quite another thing to suggest the reemergence of widespread racism within the Federal Republic. Neo-Nazis, in other words, were viewed as a fringe group. They were divorced from mainstream society and condemned by the majority for hewing to a discredited racial taxonomy. Racism, by contrast, pointed to a broader social malady whose existence might raise questions about how well West Germans had learned from their troubled past. The semantic shift thus underscored the tendency among West German leftists to understand racism as something that happens in other countries or in the past, or as a highly circumscribed problem of marginal neo-Nazis. The name change also demonstrates a lingering pattern of ideological evasion because it assumed that racialized thinking was antithetical to liberal democracy, and specifically to the liberal democracy that West Germany had become. In this view, merely invoking the concept of race seemed like the first step to allowing racism to creep back into German society. Yet this also created confusion between aspiration and reality. It was easy to assume that just because Germans had eradicated the word from their lexicon, they'd also purged racism from contemporary conditions and practices. Such taboos, of course, did not prevent the processes of racial formation from operating in post-war German society. Rather, they prevented racialization from being recognized as such. Ultimately, an anti-racism movement explicitly engaged with Turks and other immigrants did not develop until the firebombings of Turkish homes in 1992-1993. The devastating attacks prompted a huge outcry in Germany as tens of thousands of protesters took to the streets to reject racist violence. This observation takes nothing away from the citizens' initiatives and grassroots associations that worked throughout the 80s to fight racism and discrimination at the local level. But it seems important to acknowledge the ways in which Allied notions of democratization, the parameters of the guest worker program, and the Nazi legacy inadvertently produced a blindness to domestic racism and racialized exclusion that endured far longer among young West German leftists than among their counterparts in Britain and the United States. This blindness, especially as it is informed by the Nazi past, has also shaped German ideas of race and racism more broadly. So I want to conclude by considering a recent example that illustrates the larger pattern. On March 25th, 2006, in the run-up to the World Cup in Germany, right, which was played in the summer of 2006, a remarkable incident took place during a match between 4th Division German soccer teams, right? So this is pretty low-level club football, soccer. Sachsen, Leipzig, and Halle, those were the two teams, which captured national headlines. Throughout the game, Halle fans mocked Sachsen Leipzig's midfielder, Adebowale Ogunbore, who is from Nigeria, making monkey noises every time he touched the ball. Walking off the field at the end of the match, Ogunbore was accosted by hooligans who spat on him and used racist epithets. He initially ignored the taunts and kept walking, but as he passed the grandstand, endured more spitting, and heard a crescendo of jungle sounds, he'd had enough. Turning to the crowd, he put 2 fingers above his mouth to simulate a Hitler mustache and thrust his right arm forward in a Nazi salute. So, Ogunbore's gestures drew, obviously, on a well-established repertoire of racialized signs that seem predictable. He met one form of racist stereotype with another, right? Engaging in a kind of essentializing tit for tat, right? You're going to call me, you're going to essentialize me, I'm going to essentialize you. Yet, in the context of a German society that has shied away from acknowledging the problem, much less the concept of race itself, Ogunbore's response to the jeering and heckling was incisive. His symbolic choices astutely reframed the fans' behavior. They drew a clear connection between what, from the crowd's perspective, must have seemed like perfectly justifiable harassment of an African soccer player who did not belong on a German team. So between that kind of perspective and the country's shameful legacy of Nazi racism. Ogunbure's actions, moreover, named the heckler's racist ridicule in a language that they could understand. At least some German commentators grasped the implicit critique in his mimicry. Given their behavior, a reporter for Der Spiegel observed, one might think that the crowd would have appreciated the gesture and even returned it. Some of the spectators, however, reacted more viscerally, attacking Ogunbure from behind with a corner flag and grabbing him in a stranglehold. He only managed to escape to the locker room with the help of a teammate. The fans' actions bespoke an outrage at Ogunbure's defiance, his audacity for daring to answer their racial mockery. But it also communicated a more specific fury at the very notion of being caricatured as Nazis. And to a certain extent, this was precisely the reaction Ogunbure had sought to provoke. As he later explained, and I'm quoting here, "I was just so angry I didn't care. I could have been killed, but I had to do something. I thought to myself, what can I do to get them as angry as they have made me? Then when I lifted my arm, I saw the anger in their faces and I started to laugh." Tellingly, German authorities reacted to the incident not by identifying and detaining the spectators who assaulted Ogunbure. Instead, the Halle police automatically investigated the Nigerian for unconstitutional behavior because he had made the Nazi salute. The sign is illegal in Germany under paragraph 86A of the Criminal Code, which prohibits the use of symbols of unconstitutional organizations, including and especially the Nazi Party. Although the public prosecutor ultimately decided not to press charges, the authorities' reflexive pursuit and prosecution of the public reference to Nazism highlights the distinctive way that many Germans continue to understand the issue of race. At least for the police, as official enforcers of the public order, miming a Nazi gesture signaled a racist act in a way that the bodily attack of someone whose skin color marked him as foreign did not. Merely invoking Nazi signs indicated the presence of racism, regardless of the function or context of the reference. And in this respect, we might say that Nazi racism still holds a special status in Germany, eclipsing other forms of racism that are more ubiquitous and relevant to contemporary social relations. While German authorities devoted enormous energy to Ogunbure's symbolic acts, they had relatively little to say about the Halle fans' spitting, taunts, and harassment. The president of the Halle team, Michael Schädlich, claimed not to have heard any discriminatory expressions within his earshot in the grandstand. Otherwise, he explained to the Frankfurter Rundschau, "I would have intervened with security to move the stadium speaker." It's difficult to say precisely what Schädlich meant here. He seems to be implying that it was okay for the spectators to employ openly racist insults as long as no one could hear them. His counterpart for Sachsen-Leipzig, Rolf Heller, also downplayed the incident. This has nothing whatsoever to do with right-wing extremism, he maintained to Der Spiegel. It's just misguided fervor on the part of the fans. For his own part, Ogunbure had complained to Heller on multiple occasions about the hostile treatment he received during matches, but was told, "The opposing fans only want to wind you up." No one, it seems, was willing to discuss what had transpired in the stadium, much less racism as a broader societal problem. Now, my point here is not to suggest that Germans refuse to acknowledge forms of racism beyond Nazi racism. In the last decade, in fact, there has been a proliferation of government-sponsored panels, conferences, and neighborhood meetings to discuss the problem of racism in Germany. Rather, I want to underscore the ways in which the legacy of the Third Reich continues to haunt German understandings of race, and to identify some of the effects of that haunting in the broader patterns of public discourse. One basic consequence is that other forms of racism tend to get overshadowed and even minimized whenever Nazi references are in play. Any public invoking of Nazi signs, that is, whether employed to express approval of Nazism, as in the case of right-wing extremists targeted by Rock gegen Rechts, or employed to condemn its racial logics, as in the case of Ogunbore, trumps other articulations of racism operating simultaneously. Another effect is that German ideas about race continue to be informed by the older notion of Rasse, with its emphasis on biologically based conceptions of difference. Because Rasse and race are conjoined in this way, it has been relatively easy for Germans to recognize racisms in their most obvious guise, as acts of prejudice and bigotry driven by skin color or other somatic features. But it has been harder for them to grasp the broader, more open-ended conception of race. Race is a mutable and capacious category of discourse, culture, and history that is always in formation, always absorbing and mobilizing different symbols, traits, or vocabularies to mark essential, incommensurable difference. In a way, German insistence on this epistemological narrowness makes sense. A fluid conception of race, after all, contradicts the idea of Rasse as a specifically Nazi way of understanding human difference, a mode of thinking that Germans have spent the last 65 years trying to transcend. But the price of circumscribing race in this way is a blindness to the racial assumptions that authorize the increasingly common sense view of Muslim Turks as fundamentally incompatible with Germans. In this framework, the oppression of Turkish women, the propensity of Turkish men to violence, the poor performance of Turkish children in the German educational system all remain uninterrogated truths that corroborate an inevitable conclusion, that Muslims simply cannot be integrated into German society. It also seems important to acknowledge that this pattern has extended to scholarly debate. Although historians have begun to recognize the central place of guest workers in transforming West German society, many continue to resist the notion that Anglo-American conceptions of race might be applied usefully to Germany because of the country's unique history. In this respect, scholars of Germany have taken a position similar to that of many French scholars and intellectuals who dismiss English language notions of race as un-French. While it is necessary to remain cognizant of the historical specificity of Rasse and race, there has been a lack of clarity about the divergent careers of the two concepts. In post-war Germany, Rasse was dismissed as bankrupt and repudiated precisely because of its vexed association with National Socialism. But in the United States, race has cycled through many different conceptual lives and political projects. Used initially to connote essentializing logics of difference in specific North American contexts, for example, pro-slavery ideology in the antebellum South, or the Jim Crow claim of separate but equal, the concept has more recently been wielded to deconstruct and historicize older ways of thinking. Many U.S. scholars now see race as a mutable and historically contingent ideological construct, a flexible framework for apprehending ideas of difference in their particular contexts. In this sense, it seems to me, American efforts at demystifying race are eminently exportable. What they help us to see are the more localized ways of constructing difference, whether in relation to physical attributes, culture, nationality, or religion, that are never real in the older mode of scientific racism, but which nonetheless continue to have historical efficacy, especially when they are unmarked, unnamed, and largely undiscussed. Thus, the refusal of many scholars to take seriously the key role of race in the Federal Republic has come at a high cost. This stance has made it extremely difficult to grasp the myriad ways that German assumptions of essential difference naturalized the legal and social exclusion of Turks, from the basic expectations inscribed in the term guest worker to the reluctance to revise Germany's outdated citizenship law based on blood and ancestry, from the vociferous insistence by many contemporary critics that Turks are inassimilable, to the continuing struggle to imagine any notion of German national culture that might encompass different traditions, customs, and values and religions. Thinking through race in the sense of racial formation or racialization, then, is absolutely crucial for grasping the obvious and not so obvious ways that difference has continued to structure German society in the post-war period. Finally, I want to suggest that race as an analytic category is especially crucial for how we understand one of the most pressing issues facing contemporary Europe, namely the growing sense among many Europeans that Muslims simply cannot be integrated into liberal democratic society. In many ways, in various ways, a number of European countries followed Germany in retreating from the concept of race in their post-war public discourse. The French, for instance, have maintained a fervently colorblind ideal of citizenship, which they root in the founding principles of republicanism. The silence has largely prevailed in the contemporary period, even amidst the steady drumbeat of public controversy around the ethnic, religious, and cultural differences separating Europe from its Muslim others. In the last 5 years, the Swiss banned the construction of minarets. The French passed a law forbidding the burqa. German Thilo Sarrazin published a book blaming Islam and Turkish immigrants for dumbing down German society. Particularly striking in so many of these cases is a troubling elision. In the process of grappling with the tricky dilemma of multicultural coexistence, the values of pluralism, civil liberty, and individual emancipation have become translated discursively into emblems of ethno-national identity and the broader humanistic heritage of European civilization. In this way, such controversies feed a racialized narrative of the intractable clash between European society and Muslim minorities. And for this reason, it seems especially urgent and necessary to be able to name the silence around race that has continued to inform this political discourse. All right.